Do you like big, beautiful trees, painting, lots and lots of pets, and adventure? Well, if you do, I'm sure you'll like Emily Carr too. She is famous for painting incredible pictures of nature and trees, forests, and totem poles. Emily Carr was born in Victoria on beautiful Vancouver Island. She grew up in a house on a street called Birdcage Walk. Today, that street is known as Government Street, and Emily's childhood home is now a museum of her work. Emily's dad was very strict, and her mum was quiet and gentle. There were a lot of rules in the Carr household, and Emily didn't really like having to follow so many rules. There were 6 children in Emily's family, 5 girls and 1 boy. Emily was the youngest girl. Growing up, Emily's nickname was Small. Small liked to make a mess, and one day she was dressed up in her best clothes and went outside to explore. When her parents went to go and find her, she was covered head to toe in mud. Her beautiful clean clothes were not so beautiful or clean anymore. Emily was an adventurous child. She loved to explore, and she liked to play in the cow barn. She talked to the animals and tamed ducks and chickens. She even tamed crows. They would come and sit on her arm. Emily Carr had a very special pet. His name was Johnny, and he was a retired circus pony. Retired means that you no longer need to work at your job. Johnny used to work at the circus, and then he became Emily's pet. At the time, it was not considered very ladylike or proper for a girl to ride a horse in the same way that a man did. Instead of sitting upright in a saddle like everyone does today, girls were expected to ride side saddle. Doesn't look very comfortable, does it? Emily thought this was a really silly rule, and she decided she would ride her pony the way she wanted to. Her parents were not very happy, but Emily didn't care. Emily had a great interest in art. She loved looking at nature and noticing the different colors and shapes in flowers and trees. She didn't have access to proper art supplies, but she didn't let that stop her. She found a paper bag and used charcoal from the wood stove to draw on it. She made her own easel from sticks. She was a very resourceful child. A resourceful person is someone who is good at figuring out how to make things that they want. Emily was very proud of her paper bag drawings, and she showed them to her family. Her father thought her drawing was very good and hired a lady named Miss Wood to teach Emily and her sisters how to paint with watercolors. When Emily was 19 years old, she moved to San Francisco to go to art college. Moving so far away from home must have been a very big change for Emily. It's a good thing she liked adventure. Emily enjoyed her stay in San Francisco, but was excited to return home to Victoria when school ended. After a few years at home, she packed her bags again, and this time she traveled really, really far away. She went to London, England. That was thousands of miles away from Victoria. Emily studied art in London for 4 years, and then she discovered Paris. Artists like Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse lived in Paris and were creating exciting new art. Can you guess what Emily did next? Yep, she moved to Paris to study art. Emily wasn't able to understand her art teacher's French accent, so sometimes she didn't know whether her art teacher liked her work. That's okay. Emily loved living in Paris. She learned a lot about French art and culture while she lived there. After living in Paris for a while, Emily got very sick. The doctor told her that she was allergic to big cities. What a thing to say! You can't be allergic to a city. What did he mean? He meant that she was homesick. Poor Emily, she missed her friends and family. Emily was very interested in the First Nations of Canada. She loved First Nations art. First Nations is the name given to the people who lived in Canada hundreds and hundreds of years before anybody else did. Emily liked to travel to remote villages in northern British Columbia to sketch and paint the landscapes and examples of First Nations art that she found there. The Nucha Nuth First Nations gave Emily a new name. They named her Klewick. Do you know what Klewick means? It means laughing one. What a great name! What would your First Nations name be? Emily Carr loved camping trips. She loved sketching and painting the beauty of the Canadian forests on these trips. Emily had a portable studio that she called Elephant, which she brought on her trips. She would fill Elephant with food, water, and art supplies, and then she would camp in the forest. Emily had lots of pets. She had chickens and rabbits and sheepdogs and parrots, cats, and even rats. One of Emily's favorite pets was her monkey, named Woo. Emily would dress Woo in a doll's dress and walk around town with Woo on her shoulder. What a strange thing to see! Emily Carr decided to build her own house near the home where she grew up. She called it the House of All Sorts. It was kind of like a hotel with an art studio in it. And guess what? Emily lived in the attic of her House of All Sorts, a real attic. She hung her furniture from the ceiling and pulled it down when people came to visit. Would you like to live in an attic? The House of All Sorts was a boarding house, and that means that people rented rooms in the house to live in. It also means that Emily was very busy. She was the landlady, maid, cook, janitor, and repairman for the house. How did she ever find time to paint? Even as she got older, Emily kept very busy. She continued to paint until she was 73 years old. She would even sell her paintings on the corner sidewalk in Victoria. Well, it's time to say goodbye to Emily Carr. Goodbye, Emily. Thank you for sharing your love of nature and beauty with us through your amazing paintings.